Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 245 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on June 11th, 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, we have a couple of news topics to cover. One or two of them are kind of interesting, but there's nothing too massive. But our main topic is going to be continuing our rewatch of both series. We're going to be doing 3 episodes again. 1 Korra episode, that's K106 and the winner is, and then 2 Avatar episodes, that's 107 and 108, so the Winter Solstice 2-parter. Spirit World and Avatar Roku. So we'll get to them after the news, but we'll start off with just really quickly on this one. This just kind of came out. It's just another kind of Avatar cross brand. This is Avatar Cross Black Milk. It's a clothing line that just recently came out. It looks like it's more than just sort of, images on t-shirts and stuff like that. They've actually tried to do something here. There's definitely some stock imagery here, but, it feels like it's the first time we've seen sort of Avatar leaning more into a fashion sense. So it's interesting enough, but there's not too much to say. Any thoughts on this?
No, yeah, it definitely is leaning on the fashion side of things, which is kind of cool to see that they're trying to some, more unique patterns that we don't typically see. So it's worth it to check it out for that if you're interested in it.
Yeah, and they do it's Avatar and Korra, so it is interesting that they're including Korra. Not a lot of companies are including the Korra stuff, so it's somewhat interesting. Next, U2s have announced another figure. They just feels like every month announce a new figure. This time out, it's a 1 foot tall Appa and Aang figure that just went up for pre-order yesterday. It's kind of cool. It's kind of Appa big, sitting down, and he's kind of holding Aang in his kind of 2 front paws. It's a nice looking one, but like I've said before, I don't think the U2s interest me all that much because they're not particularly available and they're kind of expensive for what they are. But it's pretty nice. I like this one. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, this one does feel quite expensive, but I guess that's because of the size of it. I don't know, but it does feel pretty, unique. Like, out of all the ones that they have, this one feels like, if you're into them in general, this one might be one that's more worth getting just for its, how it stands out compared to the other ones, but it is quite expensive.
Oh yeah, I actually just looked at the price there. Yeah, 120. That's very expensive compared to like the other ones, which are more like 30 or something. So yeah, it's big, but it's not that big. So that's that. Last bit of I suppose merchandise news is that Good Small Company have announced a Korra item. Unfortunately, it's not the pop-up parade Korra. We're still waiting on that. Not sure what's taking that so long. But what they did do is they announced that they're going to be kind of reissuing the Nendoroid Korra from a few years back. So the kind of re-release here is planned for December this year, but I believe that's like the Japanese release date. It's going to be more like the first couple of months of next year when it, I suppose, actually releases for most people. Still good that they're doing this. There's definitely a demand for this to be redone for a while, and especially now that the Aang has just been announced, they had to do this ultimately. They seem to overall have a good habit of redoing a lot of them, so there's nothing new about this. It is just the original figure just being re-released, but nice that they're doing it. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the prices for these were pretty high if you were trying to find them other places online, like eBay and stuff. So yeah, this can help out a lot of people because we have noticed that it has been something that people have wanted as, the fandom has, grown a little bit bigger when the re-release happens.
Yeah, like a month or so ago when they announced the Aang, I think the Korra was still going for $200 or something like that online. So much needed ultimately, but yeah, hopefully they announce that pop-up parade Korra soon. That feels also like a needed piece of merchandise. Next we'll go into the Avatar Legends role-playing game June Kickstarter update. So there was actually two updates this month. One was just that I suppose, second from final PDF release of the Wan Shi Tong book came out. It just is a typo fix, there's nothing new in it. But the proper update is called Printing Updates Final Core Book PDF. So they have an update, and it's positive, but it's not like what we wanted, I suppose. They just say, good news, Team Avatar, the printer is now running at full capacity. This means things will be going faster and very soon. We'll have a shiny new updated timeline for you. We wish we had one for this update, but sadly it hasn't happened yet. It's going to take some time to sort through the backlog and give us a solid timeline. And yeah, I guess another update will give us that. And then they just talk about how, because they're getting so close to the printing actually happening, the absolute final PDFs for both books will be available at the very least by June 17th, so by next week. And again, they reiterate that they're going to be at one of the cons coming up soon. It's good that the printer's up to full capacity, but if you go back to the last update, in it it said even at full capacity it will still take a few months to be printed. So it's not like this suddenly means we're going to get the stuff in a month or two. This is still looking like very late in the year, if not still being into next year, unless they really can get hands on things. Because again, they're printing in China, so they're going to need to get the stuff printed, which will take a few months, the stuff from China to America, and then shipped from there to everywhere. And especially, like, say for me, international, that's like two international shippings to eventually get it to me. So it's going to be a while still, but kind of positive, but not what we wanted. But any thoughts on this update?
Yeah, I guess this is like the best positive you could have hoped for with everything that they've said before. So, it's nice that they're moving forward and they're going to get the final versions of things. So hopefully they stay on track.
Yeah, it's just a bit frustrating that like that's now basically 2 months in a row where they're going like, we wish we had we wish we had a timeline, but we don't. We wish we don't have a timeline right now. There's going to be some negativity if they don't have the timeline for next month. We definitely need a date because it's quickly spiraling out of control. It was February, now it's the last time they said an update was sort of like summer. Now we're thinking more end of the year, so that's interesting. And then the most significant piece of news that happened, that actually just came out yesterday. So this is a new book release. It's a reprint, but it's something kind of new, a little bit unexpected, even though realistically it was going to happen eventually. So Legend of Korra Turf Wars Omnibus Edition has been confirmed. So it's going to be out November 15th, 2022. We do have a new cover here by Irene Ko, so they've brought her back on to do the cover for this book. And for the most part, I think that's really all there is to say. Well, we'll talk about the cover in a second. But yeah, there's a few things to discuss, I suppose, surround this. But just in general, what are your thoughts on Korra Omnibus Editions getting confirmed here?
Yeah, I mean, we speculated this like a long time ago, so I guess it's not, like you said earlier, it's not too surprising that they're getting this. I guess, I don't know, I don't really know when to expect this sort of thing, just considering like their timelines of doing everything, but I'm glad that they're going forward with it.
Mm-hmm. The new cover, interestingly, it is not done in any way to try and resemble the omnibus style of cover. They seem to just let Irene Ko do a new cover for Turf Wars. So it's kind of it's Tokuga and Jargala big in the background, and then sort of smaller but up front, Korra and Asami. I like it in that I think Irene Ko's art works well in kind of highlight kind of images like this, more so than page to page. But I do feel that it's one of those ones where I'm kind of like, I don't really need Tokuga or Jargala on the cover because the plot of Turf Wars is not like stunning. So it's kind of weird that Korra and Asami are like the smaller part of it when they probably should be the focus, because everyone reads Turf Wars because of the Korra Asami stuff, not really the actual triads versus creeping crystals kind of plot that happens in it. So it does say cover not final, even though it looks very complete. So I'm not sure what the deal is there, in that, like, what are they going to change on it? But what are your thoughts on the cover?
Yeah, no, I wonder about that, if they're really, I mean, it seems like it's too far along that they would like rehash it or something like that, but who knows? But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the prominence, I mean, it fits like the standard mode of, like, you know, most of the comic covers where you have, like, you know, whoever's the main antagonist or, you know, conflict is in the back and the other characters in the front. So it fits the mold, but I get the point of, you know, that not particularly being, you know, the most compelling thing for this book, at least, you know, when it was first announced and everything like that. So I definitely get that idea there, but I don't know. I mean, it's still a pretty neat cover, how they have it designed and everything. So I think it definitely, you know, it feels like it fits, you know, the comics. So I think it's worth it for that if you don't already have it.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the last thing to talk about with this is just that, obviously, why are we going into Korra Omnibus editions before we finish the Avatar Omnibus editions? Where's the Imbalance Omnibus edition? That's a question that a lot of people were talking about. My speculation, and I said this in my video that I put out covering this news yesterday, is that I'm guessing that they are releasing these omnibus editions in publication order. So the publication order is actually that it goes north and south, Turf Wars, Imbalance, Ruins of the Empire. So rather than treating Korra and Avatar as being completely separate, I'm guessing they're just doing it that way. So if this is true, Imbalance Omnibus would be the next one, in potentially a couple of months after this. So what, like March, April next year or something like that. And then more like, say, September next year would be the Ruins of the Empire Omnibus. So that's my speculation on that. But what are your thoughts on that they've gone to Korra before finishing off with Imbalance?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense if they're trying to keep everything in order of things. I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to go about it in terms of like what's popular, but I don't know. I think I like that they're actually getting to Korra, because that, you know, there's not as many, you know, Korra comics in general. So, you know, getting those out, you know, maybe it's worth it just to start getting those going and everything. But yeah, no, I mean, you know, I'm sure eventually they'll get through all of them, since that seems to be, you know, what they're able to focus on now, rather than, you know, doing any other sort of like newer stuff. So I don't know. As long as they keep up the pace of this, at least it seems like they're keeping something on track.
Yeah, and I'm glad they're doing these, because once we're through these omnibuses, it feels like, okay, you now don't have any other reprints to do. You've reprinted like every book that you've done. So they either have nothing on their schedule, or they have to announce new books, and that's where we're going to be at eventually. So I'm almost waiting for that kind of time period to just get into like, okay, your move, Dark Horse, you've got nothing else to put out. Do you have anything? What's going on? But, you know, still, this is good. I doubt there's going to be anything on the spines, because there's only 2 Korra books. They could do some sort of a thing where it's a small image across 2 spines, but they probably won't. And it's the same for the Imbalance. It kind of creates a bit of a weird spot where, is that just going to be a generic one on the end with the 5 other books? Who knows? But you know, nice to see this finally happen. And obviously it's, you know, it's a book announced here in June for a November release, meaning that for books to come out this year, we pretty much have, like, I suppose, books announced next month to hit December. Otherwise, they're probably not going to come out this year. And then, if for anyone worried about delays, typically the reprint books don't get hit by delays that much. So I do have some confidence this will actually come out in or around November 15th. It might be pushed back by like a week or two. That tends to happen to a lot of books. But I don't think this will get like 6 months worth of delays. I'd be very surprised at that. So that's all the news. Other than that, we are just basically leading up to the release of The Dawn of Yang Chen in just over a month, and also San Diego Comic-Con if anything happens there. That's what we're kind of looking to at the moment. But we'll move over into our main topics for the episode, which are our episode reviews. So like I said, we've got a Korra episode and 2 Avatar episodes to cover. We'll start with Korra here because we've got a 2-parter on the Avatar side of things. So we'll do Korra first, and that is K106 and The Winner Is. So the kind of mid-season finale for Book 1. I really like this episode. I think this starts a run of episodes for Book 1 that is really, really, really high quality. 6 to 12 is an incredible run of episodes, I think, across any Avatar series. They're all really, really good, and this one is definitely good to transition from our sort of introductory stuff into, okay, the action is finally getting going here. We've put aside the more kind of pro-Bender plot. Korra is going to have to focus on dealing with the threats that are actually in play, and there's some great action in this as well. So I'm a big fan of this episode, but what are your overall thoughts on K106?
Yeah, no, like you said, this definitely, it feels like a mid-season finale. It definitely has a lot of action, from the pro bending, from the actual fights that they have here, and really just, you really understand that this is really a conflict that's going on in this city that's going to have to be dealt with. So it really lends itself towards, forcing the viewer to understand, what's really at stake here.
Mm-hmm. So I'll jump in with the pro bending stuff straight away, because for the most part, this is about the last pro bending we get sort of in the series. Yes, they reference it right at the start of book 2 just to get across that only Bolin is on the team and it doesn't work out. And then in the Korra video game, they have some other stuff that happens with it, like the charity tournament. But in terms of the main series, this is it coming to an end. So we have our final here, Fire Ferrets versus Wolf Bats, and it's a really good fight. They give it some quality animation here while also getting into some of the technicalities of pro bending, and that they use the wolf bats cheating to highlight what some of the other rules are in the sport. So that's really good. Obviously, it's one of those things where we see the initial cheating. They nearly get the knockout at the start. Korra throws Mako back up. It begins to frustrate the wolf bats. Round 2 is a tiebreaker. So they stay in the fight. They get to the tiebreaker. It's water. So it's Korra versus Tano. Tano gets schooled basically by Korra in the tiebreaker, so it's 1 round all. And then in round 3, the frustration builds with the wolf bats, and then they rather blatantly cheat with the crushed earth in the water headshots for the triple knockout. So I think this is kind of pro bending in a way at its best. I would love to see a really heavy focus on action. Pro bending get its big chance to shine at some point, but this is some of the best that we've had so far. I like it. It fits. Sure, there's a little bit of a frustration that the Fire Ferrets didn't win, but it helps Amon's point later on that the cheaters win and become 4 times champions. But what are your thoughts on the actual final match?
Yeah, it does serve a purpose for them actually losing, but the match itself, like you said, is done really well. You definitely get a lot more of the technicalities. You even see, Tenzin get really into the game because he's been brushing up on it now that, Korra's been a part of it so much. So they have that little line there as well. So no, I really like it. I mean, I like, the pro bending in general. So anytime I get to see that is always a plus for me personally. It would be interesting to see sort of maybe not the whole 3 rounds or anything like that, but maybe 1 round in more detail, just so that we can see more of the back and forth and see it in more of almost pseudo real time in terms of how long the matches actually go for and everything like that. But no, I think for what they're trying to go for here and get it across and show the different techniques and show how things can be abused and the refs being paid off, it does a good job of showing that, as well as the commentary from Shiro Shinobi. I think that's always a plus to see in these parts where we get the pro bending, and even later on where he's commentating on sort of the downfall of everything as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's there's some great animation here. Like I think Tano does this really cool thing where he like runs into the turnbuckle, does like a backflip water attack. The you see that the Wolfbats are actually a good team in that they clearly can win without cheating, and likely did win most of their matches without needing to cheat, because they are actually very, very skilled. In that the start of the first round kind of gets that across that, like, okay, he goes for the sort of water uppercut at the start, but it's like relatively okay until they get a bit frustrated and begin to start to cheat. So it makes you wonder with them of like they've won. This is their fourth win. Did they win the first one normally and then cheat to sort of keep themselves in the spotlight? I'd like a little bit more of a kind of backstory on these guys, and like who they are, because it'd be weird if, like, say, like a rookie team immediately comes in and just cheats to become champions for the first time. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of like the history of the Wolfbats here? Do you think they've always been cheaters, or did that happen later?
Yeah, I mean, that it definitely would feel kind of odd if they cheated straight from the get-go, because like you said, like you can see that they definitely have some skills, some abilities. They're able to work with each other really well. I mean, they work even well, when they're cheating with each other as well. So you can see, like, how in sync they are with each other, which, from everything that we've seen about pro bending, is definitely like a key element to the game, and most team sports as well. So they definitely have that, compatibility with each other. But yeah, I think, knowing the history might be interesting. I mean, it's not like a huge thing that you really need to know. The overall, towards the overall plot of what they're going for the series, it's not like a huge thing. So maybe it would have been a cool, like, addendum, like when we got the rules for the game or something like that, or, when we know a little bit about, like, some of the trainers and some of how pro bending was back in the day. It would have been cool to see, sort of like what was their rise to, their championships over the years or whatever. But no, I think it's definitely, adds a lot of, I guess, a bit of intrigue to wonder, like, what could have been with them or whatever. Or maybe when we do see, Tano later on, where he's talking about, like, the healers and stuff, maybe then he would have, like, fessed up to some things or whatever. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Because the plot in the core video game is that the Fire Ferrets do face the Wolfbats in the final there. That's the sort of canon story from the game. And the Fire Ferrets do win with the idea that, I guess, the Wolfbats don't cheat in that one. So it confirms that, like, obviously, like, Tano gets his bending back eventually, and they go back into pro bending more normally. I suppose, since, like, we probably won't be talking too much about pro bending going forward, what are your thoughts on the fact that they don't really bring it up again? Because most people are really not familiar with the video game, and the book 2 is the scene in book 2 is just to transition us completely away from pro bending, that none of the characters are kind of really involved in it anymore. Why do you think they just completely move it aside for the remaining 3 seasons, and after book 2 don't even mention it at all?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of, like, the grand scheme of things, it's not, like, as important, since it is sort of, more focusing on sort of their time when they were actually really part of it. And with them not being part of it, we mentioned earlier that Bolin is part of it for a little bit, but, he has sort of, like, the other people with the team, and it seems like everyone's moved away from it. I mean, it is cool that they do use the arena, later on, as we've mentioned. But I don't know. I guess it really doesn't feel like, in the grand scheme of things, it really has an important role towards, everything that's going on. So I'm just unfortunate that they sort of push it aside, because I think it is a really cool element to, like, the city in general, in terms of just how, this is, like, the main form of, like, entertainment that the city has. But especially when the characters aren't there as well, you can kind of see why it would get pushed to the side in those instances. Although I think it would be nice to have it sort of, like, mentioned in terms of just general world building for, like, the city itself, because it is, at least it seems like, it's an important thing, assuming that they keep it going.
Yeah, like even just little things, like, just seeing a newspaper and seeing, like, oh, this year's pro betting champions are whoever. Like, do the Wolfbats ever win again, or is there a new up and coming team? Do one of the other teams that we know about, like the Rabaroos, ever win? That sort of thing. But we'll go back to the scenes that take place before the actual match, and that is there's the Amon taking over the radio. He calls on the council to shut down the pro bending arena and cancel the final. And then we get the scenes at City Hall where, of course, the Fire Ferrets walk into the meeting and they have their big discussion, and they use this primarily as the reintroduction of Lynn into the series, because she was there right at the start, hasn't really made many appearances, and this is pretty much, okay, let's finally do something with Lynn other than she dislikes Korra. So there's some very interesting stuff going on here. Tarlok politicking here, where surprisingly, they're all actually in agreement that they want to shut down the pro betting arena and cancel the final. And even Korra's like, what, Tarlok, even you're willing to kind of lean in this direction? And he actually says that he won't put lives at risk. So that's a little bit of a contrast to what he later kind of goes on to do. But Lynn is the turning point in all of this. She actually agrees with Korra and the Fire Ferrets about what's going on, that they shouldn't just basically give in to the equalist demands in all of this. And there's some interesting points that are made here. I think Mako tries to give the big speech about how pro bending actually unites people in the city, and that it's the favorite sport of both benders and non-benders. So there's a sense that, like, yes, there's an undercurrent of people not liking benders, but there's a lot of non-benders who are perfectly fine with this situation and do like this entertainment that is, benders fighting each other. So there's a few interesting kind of points being made in all of this, but the net result of this scene is that Tarlok switches his vote because he basically creates this sort of deal with Lynn where Lynn is taking full responsibility for this going okay. And if it doesn't, it's on her, not on the council. And so Tarlok, of course, the other members vote with Tarlok, and it means Tenzin's left as the only one who's actually wants the arena shut down. So some very, very interesting stuff going on here. What are your thoughts on these sort of city council scenes and the reintroduction of Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, Lynn's such a fan favorite character. It's always cool to see when she comes back into play. And, she has, this sort of like abrupt personality. Like she, destroys the gavel with like her metal bending cables, which seems pretty like abrupt and something that you wouldn't do in like such like a official capacity. But I guess, she can just get away with stuff like that. And, she also gets her way in terms of like supporting the tournament and the championship and everything like that. So I don't know. I think it's cool to see, some of these more politics side of things, just because that is, more of an intrigue for this, newly-ish formed city and how everything works, and then eventually how it's changed even later on. So, you get to see how the council works in another sort of official capacity in this instance here.
Mm-hmm. And referencing some stuff that happens later, I suppose, Tarlok latches onto this, I guess because he realizes that there's only so much control he can have while Lynn is the chief of police, and that he can move to do more when he has a chief of police that he can control. That's basically what happens when like Saikan takes over and Lynn isn't really here to do anything. You can sort of see that when she walks in, she does, Tarlok is the one holding the gavel, and he's a little bit intimidated by her. So you can see that he's like, oh, I can't make my moves with her still here. So it just highlights that, okay, like Lynn's important. She is an esteemed chief of police, as is stated here, and her opinion kind of matters to people. So Tarlok using this to get her out of the way, as we'll see in the coming episodes, is a pretty important plot point in terms of, let's remember that Tarlok's also a villain in this book also. That brings us into, I suppose, aftermath of the fight, the pro bending match. The Equalists make their move. Really, really amazing scene. We see that they have people in the audience all over the place. They put masks on, shock gloves on, and it's revealed that they've basically taken stuff in with them. And pretty much, even though there's huge security, Lynn was prepared for a lot to happen. everyone gets taken out like straight away. It's a huge coordinated effort from the Equalists here to do what they actually do, and it leads to, of course, Amon rising up in the arena to confront the Wolfbats. But what are your thoughts just on that sequence as like the Equalists make their move?
Yeah, no, I think that's always been like a highlight of this episode, just because of how coordinated it is, how swift it's done, how, from before, Glenn was just boasting that, they're impervious to their attacks, which, up until this point, they pretty much were impervious to the attacks, at least as far as we understand from chi blocking and everything. So, they had, as far as we knew, all of the advantages they could have to protect the people in the arena. But, you can see how that didn't really work out, that Amon was really prepared. And you get to see, like, a little bit of that preparation that they were doing, loading up the trucks with the containers and stuff like that. So you can see that, Amon's forces are pretty well, stocked and supplied, which at this current time we don't really know how it is, but once you do learn, with everything with future industries, you can understand how they had such support. So yeah, they really are prepared. But yeah, that sequence works really well. And then you also have, Shiro Shinobi commentating on it as well, which is funny and scary at the same time. So it definitely, stands out as one of those, I guess, more iconic scenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his whole narration through, like, yep, they're in the booth with me now. Oh no, that's very good. But yeah, what happens from here, obviously, like I said, Amon is in the arena with the Wolfbats. He has a few chi blockers with him. They basically have a match here, and the Wolfbats get taken down very, very easily. Now, of course, we later learn that, like, Amon is... It's not just that he's amazing at, like, dodging. He is using, like, subtle bloodbending to sort of slightly put attacks off course. And that's part of why he comes across here as such an amazing non-bender fighter. Now, it's not clear when exactly he does this or doesn't do this. Might he have needed to use it against Tano or not? Either way, he gets the advantage here. We know how skilled Amon is, because we know the reveals that happen later. But Tano does get his bending taken away. And like they kind of do for basically the entire rest of the series, they treat a character getting their bending taken away as if they're kind of killing that character. The close-up, terrified look on Tano's face, the fact that he, like, collapses to the ground, and then they just sort of, like, kick them off the arena, and they're just kind of lifeless as they fall into the water. It's kind of brutal the way they show it here. And then, of course, just the visual of, in front of the crowd, they show Amon taking out the bending champs. And then we'll get into the speech that he gives in a second. But what are your thoughts on the action sequence here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does, reinforce what he states just in the moment that, really the best in the world have nothing, compared to him. And, of course, no one else knows sort of like the tricks and techniques that he's using to achieve these things. But from all intents and purposes, just viewing this and, the arena is packed, of course, it seems like he has no issues dealing with, the supposed best in Republic City or the world, or however you want to consider it. So definitely, it holds a lot in terms of like intimidation factor, which is, of course, the whole thing that Amon is about. Just that fear that he instills in the whole city and the general populace, which, is probably why they're able to sort of like control the arena as well as they can. Because, just in the grand scheme of things, there's not really that many Equalists there. Like, I'm sure if everyone were to riot, they would have a hard time controlling the situation. But, everyone's just so shocked with what he's able to do.
Mm-hmm. And he does give a speech after doing this, and he kind of makes the point about, you are celebrating cheaters here, that we've just taken down the best of the bending world. And he makes the point that, like, oh, you're celebrating benders who threaten and cheat and, like, use their power to their advantage. That's just what's happening, like, in a more general sense as well. He basically says anyone who stands against him will have their bending taken away also, and that the Equalists now have the strength to dominate. He then brings up the point of, like, benders have always had an unnatural advantage over ordinary people, and that the new tech that they have of like the shock gloves and so on, evens the playing field and suddenly allows anyone to basically be the equivalent of a chi blocker. And so he basically says the Republic City first, and that the rest of the world will follow. So you almost forget about it because he's just the villain for the first season, but that the ultimate plan is to spread this across the world and basically equalize everyone. And he just says this and then decides to leave. His airship arrives and he leaves out the roof. So very, very big power move from Amon here, just dominating the most heavily kind of fortified place of the Benders and leaving with not much to kind of fight against him. But what are your thoughts on his speech and what he has to say here?
Yeah, he definitely drives home the point of just sort of how currently corrupt the system actually is, and it just happened in like the world's or the city's largest stage. So, he actually has, some valid points there, which I think is, part of what makes him, pretty compelling, is that you can see the reasoning behind what he's actually doing. Now, does he go about it in the right way, in the best possible way? Probably not. But, you can at least, see where he's trying to go from here. But yeah, he really, stands unopposed in this sort of situation and has like no issue, at least initially, leaving the arena.
And it is interesting because given that we know sort of how this happens, how it gets resolved, seeing him actually sort of present what like his core kind of point actually is, you kind of ask yourself, okay, how big of a problem is the sort of imbalance between benders and non-benders? It's mainly presented to us as like a few things. Like one, the council is all benders basically. So they are the leaders of the city. Two, the triads, the bending triads, are the main threat to the city. They're the ones that are actually like intimidating people with their powers. Beyond that, and I suppose he makes a sort of point about pro bending in that like these are your pro bending stars. The sport, you have to be a bender to participate in it. But then there are fans who are non-benders, like even Asami is a fan of pro bending. So there are kind of points about like, okay, yeah, benders have these certain advantages, but then there's also situations where like the top 3 companies in the city are all created by non-benders. Even Mako, who is a very powerful bender, has to sort of struggle to make money, where he's trying to be a, high up pro bender, but just barely makes enough money to like keep the training going. And then to make any sort of money, he has to use his abilities to generate electricity, which is a very specialized talent, but it seems to only get him paid like a reasonable amount. And given what we learned in like Imbalance as well, which you have to bring into play here, it does seem like there's also the reverse aspect of this, of like industries that may be focused on like benders are the ones who use their talents to do this thing, were replaced by machinery, which anyone can use. So it's always to me been like an interesting point of like some people really criticize book 1 because they don't commit to like what the solution is, like what Amon actually made happen in the aftermath of this. My thoughts have always been that, yes, he has a large following of people who don't like benders, but there's just as many people who are non-benders who weren't part of that group, and that things were not as bad as were made out to be. And so the subtle changes that we get going into the next book are actually sort of enough that there are some changes that happen and they bring things roughly back into balance. But what are your thoughts on the way they kind of get across, the whole bender non-bender conflict in book 1 and where they go with it after this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point to see. Do they take it far enough? Do they show enough of the inequality to make it worth it for what he's actually going for? I don't know. I mean, I think, when they do eventually have, the president and everything like that, and they do show, a bit of resolution with the situation, I don't know, it feels like it it might be more imbalanced than we actually really are led to believe. And it might just be more in terms of, corruption in the city specifically, where, we really see this sort of imbalance of things actually going on compared to sort of like, say, the larger world overall, which, I'm not sure, how much, Ahmad's plan has, taken into factor the larger scope of things. I mean, at one point, he just becomes sort of like the default villain as just sort of trying to make end means, without regards of what actually is sort of going on at large or whatever. So, there's the factor of that in terms of him just being like the villain per se. But in terms of the city, I mean, we did see, in one of the other episodes, sort of the people who are disgruntled enough to, come to the revelation, which did seem like a large amount. But if you factor in the city at large, there's probably a lot more that don't have as much issues as, do have issues. So I don't know, how that factors into sort of overall balance of things. But I think, for what they were going for, you see enough of it in order to see that there's a problem in some regard, but not enough that it's going to sort of like, make everything, turn the whole city into like a riot or anything like that. Like they do, put forth some effort to actually resolve it. And, not everything's even, good by the end of, Korra's, run here. Like some of it bleeds over into the comics as well. So,
yeah, because I've always felt like it's like people almost like underestimate just the value of something as simple as like that leadership change, that we go from having the council where it's clearly just bending high ups, put into these positions, to an election where the people choose a non-bender, and then we see another election in the comics, and again they choose a non-bender because there are more non-benders than benders in the world. So that's probably the way it's going to go unless there's like a stunning bending candidate. So that just by itself kind of changes things quite a bit. We see, I guess, and somewhat of a crackdown on the triads, and that they're not as big of an issue going forward after this, in that we see like something as simple as Mako joins the police force, and a lot of what he's doing is stopping triads and arresting them, to the point where it isn't that much of an issue as we go forward. And like in the first Korra comic, it's really only the remnants of the triple threat and the creeping crystals that are left. And even now, I think we only know about like 2 or 3 triads that are still active. So those two things feel like they do solve a lot of the problems that were actually presented in the show. Because otherwise, like, they don't really explain on an individual basis like what most of the people's like issues necessarily were. Like, was it about like jobs and stuff like that? I'm not sure. In episode 8, we get a bit of a dynamic, but that's more of like the issues with leadership, where Tarlok begins to go off the rails, and it more kind of retroactively tells us the issue with the council, sort of. But what are your thoughts on how they resolve things as we go into book 2, with the election of a new president, the police force go after the triads a bit more? Is there anything else that you feel needed to be done?
I mean, if they're really trying to address the problems in the city, or at least what they're presented, that those seem like the focus. I mean, they also have, more sort of like, I guess, integration into the police force as well, which makes it a little bit more rounded as well. I think that's like another important thing to consider as well. The whole idea with the president, I mean, I think, from the leadership top down, that's usually, if you can manage it at least, a good way to go about sort of changing things. There's still like, the whole idea of like the perception of things and how people are viewing things, which, is an important factor as well. And there's definitely probably, more outreach that they could do later on, which I think we get to see a little bit more of that when we, have to deal with like the spirit portals in the city and everything like that. So, there is more that they could do. But I think for what they're trying to focus on, there's enough of it to at least show that there's some progress being made.
Yeah, and then you also have to get across just like the value of Amon as like a charismatic leader, that he plays on these kind of maybe smaller issues that people have and amplifies them into being this full-on movement of everyone who's part of the Equalists seems to want to rid the world of benders. So it's gone from just being like, I have some grievances, to suddenly being like, get rid of all of them. That's, quite extreme. And that's just what he can do because he's so good at giving these speeches and so on. So, you have to credit Amon in terms of making the problem almost more than it actually is as such. So there's that. Then the final sequence of this episode is we see that the fire ferrets have basically been captured. They were also electrocuted. The arena gets bombed as Amon leaves. So quite extreme measures happening here. The arena is going down. Korra tries to do a really cool water spout to get up to Amon, but can't get high enough. Lynn steps in. We get Spider Lynn and doing some swinging here. She swings Korra up, follows her up. There's some very cool sequences here as basically Korra knocks the lieutenant down, and it leads to this kind of Lynn and Korra against the lieutenant and some chi blockers on the roof of the pro bending arena, which leads to a very cool fight that's more Korra versus the lieutenant, and then Lynn is doing the kind of more background stuff. Then Lynn tries to go after Amon, but as Korra takes out the lieutenant, the glass cracks. Korra again falls, and Lynn decides to save Korra over going after Amon. So the other arc in this episode is definitely Lynn coming to respect Korra after their initial meetings not going so well. So that's the main character, I suppose, takeaway from all of this is that, Lynn is complete 180 in the eyes of the fandom after this episode. She's awesome. She doesn't hate Korra anymore. And also for Korra, just 2 episodes ago, terrified of Amon, is actually now willing to go after him. So her break has actually done good for her. So that's very positive. And yeah, the action set piece here was fantastic. Lots of amazing choreography between Korra and the lieutenant. And Lynn with those metal wires. Really, really good stuff. But what are your thoughts on this whole sequence here on the pro bending arena roof?
Yeah, no, this is definitely a highlight moment in terms of like the choreography, like you said, and just sort of these two characters, Korra and Lynn, sort of like actually working together. This sort of starts their relationship where they actually have, respect for each other. So getting to see them work in conjunction with each other without, previously having like, worked at all with each other in any sort of like successful capacity is really nice to see here. I like, the whole fight on top of the arena, like you said, is really cool. And yeah, it is cool to see that Korra has, seemingly, at least for now, gotten past her sort of like hang up that she had before, where she was like stressing about everything. So no, I really like this whole sequence that they have here. And, Korra does, try to get at least, a couple good hits at sort of the blimp up there, dirigible, which sort of knocks out everyone else, except for Amon, which, we always wonder, like, how did he tweak things in order that, he didn't get hit by any of the effects, or maybe he's just that strong that nothing like that would affect him, at least initially, until we see some more chinks in his armor later on. But yeah, no, it's cool to see, and the fact that, Lynn, forgoes trying to capture Amon, which, in the grand scheme of things, that probably wouldn't have turned out well for her. She goes back to save Korra, who's falling down in the arena, which, for anyone who remembers when this was actually airing, that was the whole sort of SpongeBob laugh at her meme thing as well. So it's always fun to see that here as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always a memorable moment. Exact wrong timing on that, but always a great meme from early Korra. But yeah, that moment where Amon is just like looking down at the what's happening below, and just the fire comes straight up. It's just, yep, he's too cool to be hurt by this, even though it's like right there. But and you bring up a good point. Like, if any of them got up there to him, it probably wouldn't have ended well for them, because we know how powerful Amon actually is. Now, it might have forced a situation where maybe he had to reveal the scope of his powers up top, but the lieutenant wasn't there. He could have disposed of the other chi blockers around him if he needed to keep the act up, but it probably would have led to Lin and or Korra being taken out, so it's probably for the best that at this time they didn't get up there. The only other moment of the episode I don't think we've talked about is actually quite good. It's the kind of character focus part. After the initial, like, Lin steps in, she actually backs up Korra at the meeting. Lin just walks past Korra, so Lin still doesn't respect Korra for the most part at this time. And Korra actually asks Tenzin, "Do you know why she dislikes me?" And Tenzin just gets across that, like, Lin's always been challenging, and Korra thinks it's actually like, did like Aang do something? Does Lin not like Aang? Is that why like it continues on with me? But he's like, no, Lin and Aang got on really, really well. Actually, the issues are with me. So Tenzin and Lin had issues. So this is where Korra connects the dots from the Pema scene from last episode that, oh, Lin and Tenzin used to be a couple and Pema got in the middle of those two. And she actually gets Tenzin to kind of talk a little bit about the relationship before he realizes what's happening and stops. So it's a very fun scene to see Korra just get the advantage over Tenzin in this scene of like realizing that like how embarrassed Tenzin is about the whole thing. We learn a little bit more about this later on, but it's an interesting dynamic to know that like, oh wow, Tenzin and Lin used to be a couple, and that's what Pema got in between. So some big reveals in this scene. But what are your thoughts on this Korra and Tenzin scene?
Yeah, no, it was a nice bit of a character reveal there, getting some history from, Tenzin in his younger days, which, up until recently, we didn't really know that much about, but we have gotten like a little comic on, sort of how he used to be when he was a bit younger. So it's nice to get this here in terms of, just the relationship and, I guess sort of, just the idea of, all of these characters that we know from the original series. It's not surprising that their kids would be close to some degree, just with everything that's gone on with them. Just, in terms of like saving everyone from the war. So it's a nice bit of sort of character development for Tenzin and Lin.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, I don't think it ever gets directly discussed in an episode, does it? But we basically know that like the reason that they basically split up is because what Tenzin wanted kids, Lin didn't. I forget if that just came from like an interview thing or if it ever is mentioned in an episode. I think it gets like alluded to in like book 3 with Sue and Lin arguing, I think. But what do you remember of how much they go into on the Lin Tenzin dynamic?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I remember as well from, I don't know, I want to say it was an interview or something like that where we actually heard more about that, or unless it was like some of the sort of side content that was coming out when this series was actually airing, since there was some of that at the time. But yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense, and especially with how, Tenzin was raised and just his general seriousness and his attitude towards, just airbending in general, which, is something that, later on gets into a little bit of conflicts with his siblings and everything like that. It's not surprising that this would be, a point of tension in their relationship.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is everything from this episode. Other than I just made a quick note of something right at the start of the episode, is just on the radio before Amon takes over, it is mentioned that it's like an ad for Cabbage Corp that has been like a trusted leader in technology for over 50 years. So I never latched onto that one before, but like, okay, we're 70 years post ATLA in Korra, so in the 20 years after ATLA, somewhere along there is when the cabbage merchant turns his cabbage stall, cabbage restaurant, interest in technology into a corporation. So we haven't quite got there in the comics yet, but we see the seeds of it, and that he's interested in technology and so on. So nice to see that, given that Cabbage Corp will be a bit of a plot point in the next episode. And then, like you mentioned earlier on with the point about how, like, in the background of the Amon scene, you see a lot of stuff being loaded onto trucks. Where did they get this, like, mass amount of stuff from? That also gets brought up in the next episode, which is quite important. But, yeah, we'll move into the Avatar episode. So we'll start off with 107, Winter Solstice Part 1, The Spirit World. So I definitely think this is the weaker part of the two-parter. I still think it's good, because I often forget at times which section of, like, the Zuko story happens in these episodes, because I mainly think of them as, oh, this is the episode where Team Avatar is here or here. So the whole Iroh captured by Earthbenders, learning about the Siege of Ba Sing Se stuff is in this episode. So that definitely brings it up a little bit. But I think it's a little bit let down, even though I like some of the stuff they mention about the spirit world. It is let down a little bit by the details being very weird, reflecting on it, now that we know so much more, and how it feels like you have to stretch to make this fit with some of, like, the dialogue that they talk about. But there are some things that still work quite nicely, like Heibai fits perfectly as being like a light/dark spirit based on what happens. And there are still, good moments in terms of, just introducing the concepts of Spirit World is good, and setting up the next episode as well. So overall good, just a few kind of early Avatar kind of details being wrong coming up again is the only thing that lets it down for me. But what are your thoughts on Winter Solstice Part 1?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can understand the idea of it being sort of weaker of the two, which I think that's sort of like an issue for a lot of Part 1s. It's kind of hard to have them be automatically, up to par when they're starting, especially with this being like this only the 7th episode of the whole series overall. So, I think, it has been mentioned, many times that just, the start of Avatar, while good and while interesting and intriguing, which is, why we're still talking about it today, it definitely does take, a bit of time for the episodes to ramp up and be a little bit more mature. But I think even at, sort of like the surface level of things, you can see there's a lot of different, elements to this episode that make you, at least think a little bit deeper in terms of what's going on, in terms of like the forest and how the Fire Nation is affecting things, and how, Aang's really trying to figure out what to do, but he really doesn't understand it at all. So, even if Aang does have a little bit of fun in this episode, I think this one definitely is more serious, especially these two parts, than what we've seen up until this point.
Mm-hmm. So let's start off with the Zuko Iroh part of the episode, because it's interesting, but there's maybe not as much to say about it overall. So this is effectively Iroh's in a hot springs. Zuko's not interested in that. He wants to get back on the road, hunting down the Avatar. So he basically leaves Iroh behind. Iroh falls asleep. When he wakes up again, he's immediately captured by Earthbenders, and you immediately know the episode's going to do something a little bit interesting, because they are like, oh, we know who this is. This is the Dragon of the West, General Iroh, the Fire Lord's brother. The Earthbenders know exactly who he is. And like, this is our first time learning about these kind of legendary titles for the character as well. Like, otherwise we've just known, like, oh, I guess he's a master firebender, training Zuko. Interesting, but there's a few things that we don't fully know about Iroh. Knowing that, like, one of his titles is Dragon is, like, pretty crazy, and that, like, he used to be a general as well. So just on that, like, first initial scene, what are your thoughts on, this plot and some of these little early reveals with Iroh?
Yeah, no, I think this was really cool when we got this. Like, it really adds more, importance to this character who, we can tell he's interesting. He has, a lot of wise sayings, and he's training Zuko, and there's the whole relationship that they have with each other. But I think, this episode specifically definitely, hones the fact that this is someone that, isn't really to be trifled with, and you get to see more of that later on when he actually is in combat himself.
Mm-hmm. The next thing with Iroh is that we hear about how he failed to take Ba Sing Se in this legendary 600-day siege. So I think this is the first mention of Ba Sing Se. It's the first time the siege gets mentioned, and it being 600 days. Iroh acknowledges his defeat, and it's interesting that he actually sort of praises, like he's like the great city of Ba Sing Se. But interestingly, there's no real mention of like Lu Ten or anything like that. He immediately transitions this into like, my men were tired, we left. Maybe it's just saying the sort of idea of like he lost his will to fight once the death of Lu Ten happened, and the morale just kind of completely fell, so he had to do the retreat. But this is where he does the whole thing. He falls off, acting like he's asleep, drops his sandal, and this is how Zuko's going to follow him. Which is actually a quite interesting reference because it comes back in like the finale in terms of how they track down Iroh as well. So it's actually a decent reference, kind of foreshadowing stuff there. So this one actually works quite well. I wouldn't be like critical of this for not mentioning Lu Ten, just because of the exact details of the situation. It doesn't really make much sense that he just tell these random Earth Kingdom soldiers that, hey, my son died. But what are your thoughts on our first details about the siege?
Yeah, no, I think it works well perfectly with what they're actually trying to say here. Like, you can see that he has some respect for, the city in general. I think that comes across pretty well. But, the whole idea of, they're just being 600 days at a siege, which, seems super long to me. Like, I think that would seem pretty long to anyone. It seems like it's understandable that eventually there would be a limit to this sort of thing. So no, I think it's a pretty good, little bit of a lore dump here for the world.
Mm-hmm. And then one of the most interesting parts of the episode is just a quick one where we cut back to Iroh and he is able to see Aang and Fang as spirits going by. So the first hint that like Iroh's actually like spiritual as well. So it's one of these things where like I think everyone had lots of theories as we went through and gradually learned bits and pieces. I think this is just a fact that like because he is very spiritual, he is able to see Aang and Fang, rather than because he's been to the spirit world, he's able to do that. In that, like, I'm assuming, say, like, Guru Patik would also be able to see the two of them, that sort of thing. If Janora was around here, she'd be able to see Aang and Fang. But again, the details we don't really know for sure. Either way, it's a very nice kind of subtle reveal for Iroh here. But what are your thoughts on Iroh and the spirit here?
Yeah, no, I think, initially we definitely, before we knew more about how the spirit world actually works and sort of like the rules that it had, it made sense that, if you've been there that you could automatically see it. But we learned, pretty quickly that that's not necessarily the case, especially, in case of like Sokka. Like he's been there, but, as far as we know, he's not really that spiritual at all, at least in terms of what we've been described to him as a character. So I wouldn't expect him to be able to see Aang and Dragon, flying around and stuff like that. So there's your sort of like comparison point there. But, just the idea that, Iroh can do that, and, these two parts episodes are more, spiritually based. It's a nice little tidbit to actually have in there, and it's a nice bit of just foreshadowing and planning that they actually had early on, that I think out of everything we've seen, or at least how they've laid things, that part of the spirit world and stuff actually works pretty well. Like some of the other parts, maybe there's some inconsistencies there, but his character and spirituality, I think that's probably one of the stronger bits that we've gotten.
Yeah, like just in general, this episode really kind of shows that like in or around this time, they clearly had nearly everything in place for like, this is why Iroh is important. He's spiritual. He has this past with this like siege, Ba Sing Se, that like he's gotten over, moved past. It's changed him. But also the subtle like firebending moves that he does throughout the episode really gets across that like, oh, like true master here with some of the kind of clever things that he does. As we see in like the next scene where like he tries to escape, he says that he wants his shackles tightened, not loosened. So when they go to do that, he just does his move that he used earlier on in the episode to heat up the water. He heats up the shackles and uses the burning hand to try and get away. Like fire drop kick, he's all chained up, but he still basically manages to escape. And if not for the fact that we're up against, I suppose, what was it, like 3 normal earthbenders and then 1 earthbender captain, they seem quite decent. They do manage to kind of earthbend after him and get him. So it's not Iroh fighting at like full capacity here, but he still nearly manages to get away with some clever bending. So what are your thoughts on this sequence here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I almost consider, like, if he was probably really trying and he could figure out how to get out of the shackles, he probably could have got away on his own power, just because, we know his abilities and sort of what he can do, and just sort of his, I guess, like, ingenuity and his creativity in terms of, like, fire bending. It seems to be, like, pretty up there in terms of those things. But, he's also, like, a patient, type of master character who's, willing to wait and to trust in sort of like what's going to happen in the situation. So he's also not in as much of a rush, although, there's a limit to how far, he probably thinks he can get before, Zuko may be able to catch up with him. So there is a reason, I'm sure, in his mind why he's doing things at the point in time that he's doing them. But yeah, his ability to just sort of, heat up the shackles while also, like, not burning himself as well, just shows, sort of the control that he has.
Mm-hmm. This leads to the Earthbenders feeling that they have to do something straight away. So they plan to basically break his hands, his arms, because they're too dangerous to transport him without doing something like this. And I suppose there's also a combination of this, plus he's this legendary general. They feel they have to do something. And Zuko steps in right at the last minute to stop Iroh's hands from being crushed, which it's a pretty brutal thing that they like nearly showed us, and it just kind of highlights that, I guess, being very realistic about it. Like if you did encounter someone who was just so talented and you managed to capture them, that would be something you'd have to like consider if someone is just so dangerous as a bender to make sure they don't do any more damage. But yeah, pretty cool fight here. Zuko very much going for the break his root thing. All of his attacks are aimed low at the benders, who are all trying to do sort of like holding up big pieces of earth at them. And then Iroh doesn't really bend. He just uses like the chains and goes full sort of like powerhouse on them. Again, highlighting that he's a good fighter, even not just relying on like his bending talent. So this episode did like wonders for Iroh in terms of just getting across. Like, there's so much to him, and you have to respect Iroh after this episode. But what are your thoughts on this, I think, the final Zuko-Iroh sequence?
Yeah, no, the respect is definitely earned in this episode. Just the ability that he's able to manipulate the chains, which I think is always like a cool thing when you see in shows, just sort of the ability to like control, extra, weapons outside of your normal range. It just really lends to the character being interesting. So, he has some sort of, weapons training besides just his sort of fire bending that he has. So, no, I think it's a really cool sequence. You can see how, how well, Zuko and Iroh work well in terms of like fighting as a team and how they're able to support each other. And, also just goes to show you just sort of their skill level in general, because, you think that they're outnumbered, but no, they're really, the other people are just outclassed. So it really shows you, I guess, sort of the range and their abilities that they have here. So it's definitely a cool sequence here. I think it's a fun one to actually see in the episode overall.
And then also, an interesting point here is that I'm pretty sure everyone, when you get to this episode, you are rooting for Zuko and Iroh against these Earthbenders, even though the Earthbenders are actually like the good guys overall. And I think that's just interesting that they've managed to do that in just 7 episodes, that you don't really think about like, oh, Zuko, Iroh, they're Fire Nation, because you sort of care about Zuko. There's more going on here than there necessarily is. You actually end up sort of rooting for the, kind of like anti-hero kind of characters more so than the actual good guys. So I've always found that just an interesting dynamic here. They don't have too many scenes like this, but you get it here. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a good point to make, is that like, I don't know, maybe because, you just saw the abruptness of what the Earthbenders were willing to do to Iroh, that you're like, okay, that might be a little bit too extreme here, that, maybe they're in the right for getting taken down in this case. And, it looks like, the Earthbenders will probably recover from everything that's happened. Like, Zuko's not trying to, like, take, prisoners or anything like that. Like, Zuko's, pretty singularly focused on what he's doing. But, the idea that, Zuko, in order to, catch up with Iroh, had to, let go of actually, tracking directly, the bison that he saw in the sky, it gives you a little bit more, sort of early hope that, Zuko isn't, all a bad character. Like you said, like, there's a reason behind what he's doing, and you can see that, when push comes to shove, he will make sort of the better call in terms of, what actually needs to be done. So there's that whole aspect that I think is really, comes to the forefront in this episode.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Zuko deciding to go after Iroh and not Appa is a really good moment, and we see this used again in, like, the storm, to even greater effect than this episode.
Mm-hmm.
But moving on over to the other side of the episode, so after Aang discovering that clouds are made of water, we cut to they land because they see, like, a scar on the landscape, this burned forest. Aang is very upset about this, and there's a big contrast to, like, how fun-loving he is in the first scene to he's really, really upset about this, and he feels that he is responsible for, like, an entire forest being burned down, even though he had nothing to do with it. But he talks about how, he knows it's the Avatar's job to protect nature, and how he doesn't know where he's going to get help from to even be the Avatar. So that gets brought up at this point, is that Aang has had no training on what, as the Avatar, he's even meant to do, how he's meant to do it. He doesn't know anything about it, really, other than that he is the Avatar. So the setup of, like, he needs Roku's help. He's been told that Roku will help him, but he doesn't know how that's going to happen. We do get, Katara showing Aang the acorn, highlighting that the forest will grow back, which comes back at the end of the episode. Aang uses that to calm down Heibai. And this is where we get the guy from Senlin Village arriving to, bring them into play on the plot. But I do like this in terms of, this is, like, it adds to the kind of growth of Aang as a character, that he is the reluctant Avatar, and he's encountering all of these moments where he sees that if he was active as the Avatar, if he was here, maybe something could have been different. And he knows some of what he needs to do, but not all of it. So it's a nice scene. I actually like the setup for this. But what are your thoughts on these opening Aang scenes?
Yeah, I think it definitely gets across that he's come to a point where he knows that there's more that he needs to be able to do as the Avatar, and that, this is something that he actually knows. And I think, even without sort of the Avatar, idea that's been sort of instilled in him, he probably still would have some sort of, like, connection or understanding or empathy that, nature is being destroyed, and that's probably not, like, the best thing to happen. Like, that seems like that would be, like, a core trait of, air nomads in general, just with how, they view the world, even if they are trying to be, somewhat detached from things. So I like it. It definitely works in terms of just getting him to the point where he's just understand there's more that he has to do, and he has to figure out how, and that, there was at least supposed to be a way for him to actually figure out how to do these things.
Mm-hmm. So from here we go to Senlin Village, and they're pretty quickly brought up to speed on the fact that the village every night at sunset is getting attacked by a spirit, Heibai, the black and white spirit. Every night it's abducting one person. They are warned that the solstice is coming, and they're told that the solstice is a time when it comes closer, the natural world and the spirit world grow closer and closer until the lines are blurred. And also the old man does tell Aang as well that this is the first time we find this out, that the Avatar is the bridge between man and spirits. So he learns about this for the first time as well, that Aang is meant to sort of, like, act on behalf of humanity in terms of dealing with the spirits as well. So he doesn't really know what that means, but he tries in this episode, as we see. So I think so far so good overall in terms of introducing a couple of things of like, okay, there is a spirit, it's real, it's taking people. They're talking about certain times of the year. The spirit world and the physical world begin to come together a little bit. I think maybe part of the problem with this episode is that they maybe lean a little bit too much into the second part of the line, where like the lines are blurred, and that the definition of what being in the spirit world here is very off, as we'll get to. And I think they rely a little bit too much on the whole blurring of the line solstice thing to make that happen. And I think they more clarify this later when we do like the summer solstice towards the end of the series. So what are your thoughts on this? Our first kind of information about spirits and the spirit world in Avatar.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, in like isolated context of just this episode, you're like, okay, I get it, what they're trying to go for. Like, you know, they're separate, and then there's this event that sort of brings them together so that there's like a perfect overlap, more or less. You know, it's really when you consider like everything else that we've learned that is sort of, you know, doesn't make quite sense, because it seems like they're almost, you know, the way that we see here, that they're almost sort of like in a limbo of the spirit world, which, you know, doesn't quite work as well. But, you know, I guess, you know, in terms of like the issues with the village, and that the spirit is upset and they don't know why it's upset, and that, you know, it's the Avatar's, you know, job or responsibility to sort of, you know, handle these sort of instances of, you know, conflict. No, that part makes sense, and Aang is sort of, you know, learning this, and we're learning it at the same time, even if he has no idea what he actually has to do.
Mm-hmm. This leads to, I suppose, Aang waiting at the front of the village for Heibai to arrive. He walks off. Suddenly, Heibai appears behind him. It attacks the village. It actually ignores Aang initially. Aang tries to talk to it, but it's just sent flying. We see Sokka charges out, despite people warning him not to. Sokka gets taken by Heibai. So there's a bit of a chase sequence here, including some very bad CG of Aang gliding through the forest. And the key moment of the episode happens here. Right as Heibai goes to transition from the physical world into the spirit world, Aang grabs Sokka's hand, and Heibai and Sokka disappear, and Aang is left there, but it has a certain effect on Aang, which is that Aang is now a blue spirit. And this is where the confusion sort of starts in a way, in terms of their definition of what situation Aang is in feels very weird, and it's kind of confusing as to what happens. Otherwise, I actually like the way they do this sequence, getting across that like the spirit is not just this, you know, slightly alternate humanoid thing. It's a full-on like different form of being, and it's like this hulking monster. This one can't speak. Aang has no idea what to do. And we see that it has these sort of powers where it can, like, you know, transition between worlds and stuff like that. Overall, I think this is great. I think the only negative really is the really bad CG of Aang gliding, and where they get to with what happens to Aang. But what are your thoughts on this scene? Sokka being taken.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think, you know, in terms of like moving things forward, you know, Sokka being taken, Aang trying to capture or trying to recapture him, you know, that works for me, and it's, you know, enough motivation drive that, you know, it makes Aang really sort of, you know, focus or begin to focus on what actually needs to be done. And, you know, it does lead him into the spirit world, or, you know, into his spiritual form, you know, which I think at this time is not, you know, super clear what it is, because, you know, the whole idea is like, are they in the spirit world, are they not, how is he sort of like in this, and then, you know, it's like, where is Sokka actually during this whole period of time? But, you know, I think the start of this, at least it gives, you know, some push for Aang to get in there, and they sort of like do like a sort of cutaway from when he actually gets into his like spiritual form here, because we don't actually see him go into it, but it's sort of like his unconsciousness is sort of like led him into this form, which I guess in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't seem like that odd for an avatar to actually get into that state in that sort of way, especially since I guess we're going to consider that the whole idea of the blurred lines between spirit world and the physical world is sort of like maybe that makes Aang more susceptible to actually going to that mode, even if he doesn't understand that that's how he's actually doing it. So I think it kind of works for what they're trying to go for, at least in this instance here, even if in the grand scheme of things it seems a bit hokey, I guess.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where I think retroactively we can explain what happens in this episode, and it all actually, I think, works out relatively fine. It just means there are a few characters who basically say, I'm in the spirit world, or when you went to the spirit world, that are wrong when they say that, because I think it's just blatantly clear. Aang is not in the spirit world in this episode. In this 107, we don't see the spirit world ever. Sokka goes to the spirit world, and that he comes back from somewhere. He was gone. The other villagers who were taken, like you said earlier on, that there's a reason they disappear, and they're in a different spot to Aang. And they're not just saying that like Aang's in a different part of the spirit world. It's like, no, they're just not at all. This is Aang's spirit separated from his body, but his spirit is still in the physical world. And I think in reflection, what they probably would have done here is this is meant to be viewed not as Aang going to the spirit world for the first time, but Aang doing something like inherently spiritual for the first time, in that like his spirit being separated from his body is enough to create the first little connection with Roku, which isn't direct, it's actually through Fang. So I like that. It's just they get the terminology on what the spirit world is very wrong throughout these two episodes. But it's fine, like in that we know now what's going on. But it is kind of crazy that it takes until basically the stuff with Jinora in Korra to fully explain what actually happened in this episode with Aang, because we don't really see this all that much. In ATLA, about one of the only times I think we see it is when Aang talks to the past lives in the finale. It's a spirit of that avatar coming out of him, and so like it helps him maybe explain that to a certain degree. But it's weird. It definitely is. Early on, I don't think they fully knew what they exactly wanted to do with the spirit world and so on, and it didn't fully exactly work. So it's fine overall, in that the only thing that is actually wrong is just like one or two characters saying Aang was in the spirit world. That's really the only problem as such with the episode, and it's doubled down on as well, because the whole cliffhanger at the end of this episode is that Aang needs to talk to Roku, but if he was already in the spirit world, why couldn't he have talked to Roku normally? Like they had to basically add layers onto the plot and make it more complicated to justify why the entire plot of episode 8 needed to happen. That, oh, Aang, you were in the spirit world, but you actually need to go into the spirit world via a very specific way to make this happen. Now, we'll get into the 108 thing about like what exactly is going on in that scene, but it's a weird one. I just sort of accept that a lot of early Avatar has some of these complexities that they don't get right, whether it be timeline stuff related to dates and years, or some of the early lore isn't great, but that they fix it late Avatar going into Korra. But we'll progress in just a second. But do you have any more thoughts on just the sort of technical aspects of like what happens with Aang here?
No, not too much. I mean, yeah, like you said, like it does get explained eventually. I think many of these things, just when you're first learning and when you're first putting this story together. They're just, it's not all there yet. I mean, yeah, it seems like the second part of this is sort of like a cover up, and maybe they could have done like a better job with like the sages of actually explaining sort of like the spiritualness of things. I think that's something that might have been a bit lacking, that, if they had the idea or foresight, it could have been used to, explain things a bit better. But I don't know. I think for what they're at least trying to push this idea of, this is going to be the way that he's going to figure out how to talk to Roku, at least from the beginning part, it makes sense in terms of why they're doing that, at least.
Mm-hmm. So what happens here is that Aang is a spirit. He tries to go back to Katara, but no one can hear him. He can hear what they're saying, but they can't see him. They can't hear him. He calls out to Avatar Roku. We do get the reveal of stuff like, you can't bend when you're in this form. And then all of a sudden, a spirit dragon flies towards him, and using one of its sort of whisker things, which is put on Aang's forehead, which is notable, it imparts knowledge on Aang. And this is where Aang figures out that this is Roku's dragon, who we find out is named Fang. I think it takes until the season 3 episode 6 for that name to come out, but his name is Fang. This is Roku's animal guide, and Aang even makes the connection, like Appa is to me. So this is where Aang gets on Fang and is basically spiritually, in the physical world, brought to Roku. And this is the other thing. They say Aang is in the spirit world, but they do travel across the physical world. Like, the whole plot here, what you're meant to take away from this, is that Aang, through this spiritual thing, actually sees the place they need to go to physically. And it's just, again, the terminology is a bit weird. I still think the whole... I suppose this gets into the whole animal companion, animal guide thing, and what exactly it means, and that, like, do they all get spirits, or was it just Fang because he died next to Roku? What's going on here? And then I'm still back and forth on if Fang in this scene should have been visually shown as a transparent blue spirit, or should have just been a Fang in his normal colors, but just like incorporeal. Because based on what we know from before, if you are an actual spirit and you go into the physical world, an actual spirit shouldn't have the blue transparent outline around them, because that's meant to represent like a human body separated from themselves. And it's very technical. I did a whole video on this when I went through all these scenes, and they are not consistent with when they portray something as blue transparent. But what are your thoughts on this scene here where we see Fang?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he would, depending on how he got there, he would be like a different shade of how they're actually representing him. But I don't know. I mean, the idea that, this companion from Roku is, transporting, Aang to actually figure things out, because, the connection with Aang and Roku isn't quite there yet. Like, that's the whole part of, part 2, which is why they're able to actually sort of really connect with each other. And this is sort of like, as far as we know, this is like a common Avatar thing, like connecting with their more spiritual sense, whether that's past avatars or just their inner, spirituality, is always something that, takes a little bit of developing and a little bit of something pushing them forward. Sometimes it's something in the physical, sometimes it's something in the spiritual sense. But, this is like the start of it for Aang's journey here. So, the ability to sort of like, be able to be touched with sort of like the part of Fang that sort of gives him the knowledge. And, we see that used a couple times here. I think that, works for me at least.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. We get more of this as we go into the next scene, where obviously they go to Crescent Island, the Fire Temple. Aang is directly shown that you need to get to this room, and he's basically told the full thing in great detail by Fang, that you need to be here when the solstice happens, when the light is on Roku. That's when you'll be able to communicate with him. And they're getting across this idea that they sort of go into a little bit with like some of like the Kyoshi novels, that like the first time an avatar communicates with a past life can often be like like very difficult to happen. If the current avatar isn't open to it, it can be very difficult because the past avatar sort of has to like force the connection through. So I do like the idea that there's a sense where like Roku needs to connect through Fang first and then himself. Again, this doesn't happen for all of the avatars. It's a bit weird, but this is the way they wanted to do the plot this time out. It's fine. So he learns what he needs to do. He is shown a vision of a comet, but he doesn't learn the context for it until the next episode. So this is just Aang knowing what he needs to do. And Fang then brings Aang back to his body. And this is where we get, it was the spirit separated from his body. They're back again. And Aang's back to normal after this. So that helps to explain things a little bit. So that's good. What are your thoughts on the scene on Crescent Island as spirits?
I like that. I think that's a cool sequence that they have set up there to actually show Aang, without any sort of words, all visual, what he needs to do, how he has to get back there, that there's an issue that's, important enough that, he has to deal with it, even if he doesn't have the full context for it. I think, they do a really good job of showing that you got to do something and you got to be here in order to figure it out, which, leads him to later on, almost, trying to leave behind the people he's with in order to, actually do it. So, no, I think it definitely does a good job of showing the seriousness of it.
Mm-hmm. The next scene is that he again waits for Heibai that night to try and obviously get Sokka back. But this time he knows what to do, because in a way of what he learned from Fang, he knows to, I suppose, not really try to communicate like vocally with Heibai, but instead he jumps up, touches Heibai on the forehead and makes the sort of spiritual insight connection, and is able to, I suppose, relay and finally talk to him this time. But there's a few things, there's sort of like a back and forth where he sees like Heibai's true form, the light spirit form of Heibai as a panda, and then realizes that, you are just a normal spirit who is angry because the burned forest was your forest. You are like Heibai, the black and white spirit of that forest. And you're just angry and sort of, I suppose, blaming the people of this village for what happened. And Aang does what Katara showed him, shows Heibai the acorn and confirms that the forest will grow back, it will return. This calms Heibai down. Heibai returns to the panda form and leaves, and does kind of make bamboo sprout, which is used as sort of like a little bit of a gateway for people to come back from the spirit world. So they just walk out of this sort of like magical bamboo that just appeared, I guess spirit bamboo, and walk back into the physical world. And we get a joke about Sokka was gone for a full day. Needs to go to the toilet. So there's a few cool things in this. Again, I like the insight thing because it kind of connects with the chakra information we learn about later. The light chakra is in the forehead. It's the one that deals with insight and is blocked by illusion. So typically it is characters relaying like truthful information. So it makes sense that lies done through this way would be a problem. Makes sense. They're not super clear on, the extent of by which you actually can or can't do things with this, but it's a nice connection to have with the fact that Fang communicated with Aang this way. Aang does the same with Heibai. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I think that true line of, them both using this technique, and that's something that Aang has now learned and can use, later on, works really well with this. I mean, you definitely can understand the idea that, something is causing turmoil in this area. And, this is the first chance that Aang has really had to sort of like confront this and actually understand what's going on directly. So it's definitely a great, learning point for Aang overall, and just in terms of, dealing with this sort of issue and being able to, use his friends also to help with this sort of situation as well. So you get to see sort of like the value that they have in that, and then just the whole idea of, the people are actually able to come back from, like what you said, the spirit bamboo, and, even Sokka with his, sort of funny line there, and that, comes back later on as another joke as well. So no, I think it's a nice little quick conclusion to this bit of the episode.
Yeah, and the cliffhanger is quite good. Aang reveals to everyone that, like, okay, I know what I need to do next, but it's really bad. I have to go to this island to talk to Roku, but the island's in the Fire Nation, and we have to get there by tomorrow, because that's when the solstice is. So, time scale, and they have to go to the place, which is the home of their enemy. So, major cliffhanger here, pretty big for only, like, again, 7 episodes in. But we'll jump into part 2 here, Winter Solstice part 2, Avatar Roku. So we get a little bit of a kind of dynamic from the cliffhanger here. Aang wants to go on his own in order to protect his friends, but Appa prevents that from happening. Everyone is going to go. They get some supplies and money and head off. We also quickly get that Zuko is in hot pursuit. He's also in Senland Village and is on their trail. So I like that they didn't lean too much into the whole, going off alone without your friends in order to protect them thing. That can often be a little bit of a frustrating plot point. I'm glad they kind of completely went the other direction on that. But what were your thoughts on this opening scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the group dynamic, I mean, I guess it makes sense to me that Aang might have that thought, but I think it's too new in the group's development for them to really split up. Like they're not enough on their own in order to really sort of facilitate that. So I think like you said, it's good that Appa didn't really let that go forth, because I don't think that would have worked out any better in this sort of situation here. So no, it's a good bit to sort of start this off and to see that Zuko was also there. He's didn't lose their trail from the previous episode where he had to help Iroh first.
Mm-hmm. The next couple of scenes, we jump kind of straight into the action here. There's a Fire Nation blockade, of course, kind of entrance into the Fire Nation here. Of course, Zhao is the one in command of the blockade, and so we get this really cool sequence where Team Avatar realize that, okay, we're going to need to run the blockade, and because Zuko is chasing them on his ship, he also needs to run the blockade. And they get into the technicalities here of this is bad for both of them. Team Avatar is an enemy of the Fire Nation because it's the Avatar, but also Zuko's not allowed in either. He's been banished, we know that now, but they double down on it here just if you weren't fully sure, is this more of just a personal banishment thing, or is it really serious? No, it's very, very serious. Iroh is nope, you do not want to do this, he's not going to let you in. We even get one of the few times where Iroh references Ozai, and he even kind of says that my brother is not the understanding type. So they obviously never interact, but surprisingly, Iroh never even mentions Ozai all that much. So nice to get a mention there. So just within the first few minutes of the episode, you straight away get really cool action chase sequence. All the kind of 3 main parties of the season involved. Things are going to go kind of crazy here. So I like the really kind of hot opening here. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think the idea that this is such a serious situation that this is really imperative that this could work or could go really bad, I think comes across really well. You can see that they're really going at full speed here. Zuko has the engines of the ship at full max, and Sokka's asking can they even go even faster. So there's definitely a lot of urgency here, which I guess is the whole point of everything. They only have till when the sun goes down or whatever in order to actually speak with Roku. So it definitely adds a lot to sort of the just how tense the situation actually is, and the fact that Zuko shouldn't be here at all. Like you said, he can't be helped if he's actually in the Fire Nation. Zhao just says there's nothing to do with it. There's a traitor on that ship. It doesn't matter if it's actually a Fire Navy ship or anything like that. So you definitely can see that all the different parties here like just don't really care. They all have their like singular focus here, which just adds to everything that's going on. And yeah, like you mentioned, like it would be, we always mention like it would be cool to get a little bit more on Iroh and everyone and the Fire Lord's sort of like actual interactions. Like pretty much everything we see is sort of like mentioned and sort of referenced, which I don't know, maybe that's like an age gap thing, or just because they just have no love for each other at all with everything that's going on in the Fire Nation and royalty, I guess. So I don't know, it's definitely something that we always keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of fireballs, or as they call them in this episode, hot stinkers being thrown around here. Very cool sequences where like Aang on Appa tries to kind of get away. They go above the clouds, but it almost makes it even more difficult to avoid them because they can't see from a distance where they're coming from. So Sokka nearly falls off, and they have to dive down to save him. And they just about get through. Aang does a really cool airbending kick to blow away a point-blank catapult shot, and then Zhao lets Zuko through because his plan is going to be, he has no idea where they're going. Zuko, I suppose, at least has been following them long enough that he maybe knows what their path is, going in a straight line. Zhao doesn't really know whereabouts they're trying to head towards, so he's going to follow Zuko by letting him through. So they're all trying to kind of outthink each other in all of this, which is quite good. I really do like the scene where like the ships cross and they just stare at each other, because these two hate each other. Like they've only really had like the one episode together, but it's just so intense between them. It's really well done. But what are your thoughts on this? The end of this sort of blockade sequence.
Yeah, no, it definitely is intense here. Just like him staring down at him. I think, those sort of like dynamic shots is always pretty like, like we were just saying in Korra with like Amon looking down, like those always hold like sort of like iconic pose moments of what's actually going on in the situation. And you can see, Iroh's just sort of like wondering what's going on during this point in time. And you can see, they explain a little bit more of, what the actual situation is. But yeah, this whole sequence works really well. I think it's definitely, you were sort of mentioning like how the animation might not have been as good in the previous episode. I think they definitely put the effort in to make the sequence with the fireballs and Appa flying around and maneuvering in the skies. They definitely, put the budget towards making that look pretty cool, when everything is going on. So no, it's definitely a really, I guess, like energetic start to this episode, considering that, later on it's a little bit more sort of like subdued with just some general tension going on.
Yeah, they do really go all out with the animation here. There's some nice little shots of like Momo. You shouldn't know where they're doing a lot with Momo is when they're putting the good animation in. Like Momo's on like the side of Appa, putting out little bits of fur that's on fire. When they get close to the water, he hops up and catches a fish. Is a kind of, you didn't need to do that, but you put it in there to add some character, which was quite good. All that stuff is very good. So they arrive on Crescent Island. They get in, no real problem. They don't think there's anyone there. And this is when we get introduced to the Fire Sages, which I think we had seen before without any context given to them. But we get the details here that they immediately attack Aang, even though they say, we're the Fire Sages. We're meant to be, we're meant to like support the Avatar, and they just go after them. So one of them does follow them to talk to them, and that is Fire Sage Shayu, and he reveals that he is loyal to the Avatar, and that the situation here is that because they were left waiting so long for the next Avatar, a lot of them grew frustrated, but were also at the same time forced by Sozin and so on to put their loyalty towards him and the Fire Lord rather than directly towards the Avatar. So it's just getting across one of these things that's happened over the course of history, is that the Fire Sages in the last 100 years have moved towards less supporting the Avatar and more being directly under the Fire Lord. Again, highlighting the shift under Sozin to control everything. But Shayu is loyal, and we find out that his grandfather, new Roku, and that is Fire Sage Kaja, who we know about from Escape from the Spirit World Roku and so on. So he like directly trained Roku, so that's the connection there. And I like the reference there. Like we get the line, he formed these passages out of the magma in reference to Roku, because he destroyed this place before and had to remake it. So that's quite an interesting thing, given that this is the episode that sort of reveals that Roku could bend lava. So yeah, what are your thoughts here on the Fire Sages, and I suppose the history, the little bit of history we get here about the Fire Sages?
Yeah, no, I always thought that was really cool that we get this history on like the more, Avatar spiritual side of the Fire Nation, which is, initially with them, basically taking over the world in some cases. It's not something that you would particularly think that they have a lot of, but you can see here that at least at one point, they really did have that, and that was like an integral part of them, at least in terms of, their relation with like the Avatar. So to get that sort of info here, get that sort of, lore dump here in terms of, how things used to be, how things currently are, in addition with everything that we've learned about, Roku's history since then. I think it really adds a lot to this, especially us looking back at it now. There's definitely cool bits to see how this plays out in sort of the grander scheme of things. So no, I think this is a really good part. I really like, learning more about the Fire Nation and the Avatar and the Sages. There's always more room to have that stuff.
Even the kind of island itself, and the fact that this had to be sort of like remade almost, is referencing like the RPG where they go over that in the aftermath of what Roku did, the Avatar state going crazy, it caused like seismic activity around the area, which caused like issues between like the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom. So it's a nice little bit of an extra thing going on about it. And yeah, just the whole lava bender thing. I definitely still believe that I think for the first season or two of Avatar, maybe even for all of Avatar, I think they definitely were leaning towards lava bending being more of a fire bending ability, just with the fact that they seem to highlight it with Roku here. In 201, when they do the kind of Avatar state sequence, they show Zito bending volcanoes and lava coming out of them. They definitely were leaning towards firebending with this, but then I suppose really realized later that it makes more sense to be an earthbending technique overall, especially with just the idea that like he used lava bending to completely remake and then destroy for a second time in this episode this temple and the island. But what are your thoughts on that? The fact that I suppose this is the debut of lava bending in the series.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in sort of like an indirect way, you can consider that. I mean, I think a lot of these episodes, or at least a lot in the beginning, like, the whole idea of even like how the bending works specifically in some instances for like the sort of crossover, elements or abilities is sort of like a bit murky at this point. Because I mean, I guess, you definitely can understand the reason why, fire, heat, maybe that would relate to sort of lava in terms of like the general idea of how it's going to be controlled. And I think, when you're considering like it's the Avatar, like, does it really matter, what particular, bending element they're using to control the elements, because they have the ability to control all four elements. So, at that point, it doesn't really matter. It's when it comes into play with like, Bolin being able to do something like that, then you actually have to consider how it actually works, which I'm sure they weren't thinking about, those characters this early on, at least. But yeah, so I think there's something to be said there. But the whole idea that he was able to create these tunnels, and that was like the reason, or there was a reason because he messed up, is the reason behind it. I think it's definitely a really cool aspect to this, and it seems like maybe not all of the Fire Sages actually notice. So it's cool that even within the Fire Sages, some of them that are more loyal have sort of been passed down this sort of like extra knowledge potentially. It's too bad what happens at the end of the episode with the whole island and the temple, but that's just sort of how it goes.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we move on from there. a few quick sequences here. They arrive at the sanctuary door. It's closed. There's some fun stuff of like only a fully realized avatar can open the door by themselves, getting across, I suppose, the idea that I don't. Did you interpret it as just like a full power avatar not in the avatar state could open it, or with the avatar state could open it?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would consider it with the avatar state just because of how, I guess, sort of spread out, the actual mechanisms are to actually do it. Because I mean, I don't know, unless I'm trying to think of like technique wise and ability wise, like what could be said, like, would we consider, Iroh have the ability to be like ingenuitive enough in order to get, fire bending that's able to spread out that wide and be that strong as well? I don't know. Like, I couldn't see like even like, the Fire Lord, who's arguably, can say is considered one of the strongest firebenders, being able to do that as well. Yeah. So I would take it to mean that fully realized in the avatar state would have to do it, but that's just my take.
Yeah, because like I think it's somewhat like of a difficult technique, even just to create like tiny streams of fire and separate it out into 5 so that it's going into them all at the same time, and then to bump up the power to the point where it's like a really pretty solid fire stream to actually make the mechanism work. I don't think it's really within the range of a normal firebender. So yeah, it definitely fits that like a fully realized avatar would be the ones to do this. I think I've seen posts online of people pointing out that like when Aang is fighting Ozai and he's in the avatar state, he has like 5 tendrils of fire, and there's 5 mechanisms on the door, and it's kind of like, oh, there's how he would have opened the door. But obviously, though, no normal bender could do anything resembling that. So, yeah, I do think they mean avatar state for sure. But the whole Sokka idea with the, making the kind of bombs, and then Katara come up with the idea of like, oh, but it looks like it works. It's actually really, really clever because they get like Momo in there through the vents, and it looks like the mechanism has been used, and so the sages open up the door. But everything just starts kicking off at this point. Zuko's arrived, he grabs Aang goes to leave, just about gets in the door before it closes. Then Zhao arrives and captures Zuko and everyone. So the situation gets like taken over like 2-3 times in a row here. And it feels like, that mid-season finale, because Jet isn't really a mid-season finale. So this is it in a way for the series. So yeah, what are your thoughts on just the kind of plot going into overdrive here towards the end?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is really like showing that like it's just adding towards sort of the idea that Aang really, really needs to talk to Roku, and this is like he basically has to leave his friends for a little bit in order to get into this room last minute, which is like the whole purpose of them being here. Which just a second ago he was pretty upset that like Sokka's idea didn't particularly work in this case here, but it like you said, it definitely did look like it. But I think it's definitely sort of the whole idea of like the strength and the continuous fire blast that sort of didn't really work in this sort of instance here, which I think I guess even though to Sokka it looks like it it should have worked, it's not really the same sort of thing. So it just sort of shows, I guess, sort of like their lack of understanding in firebending and sort of how the technique actually works, which isn't too surprising considering up until this point they haven't really had that much experience with it. But yeah, no, so it definitely just shows everything is just really coming to pass in this situation. Like this is really like you said, this really does feel like it's the mid-season.
So yeah, there's a standoff outside the door. Zhao is basically just saying, well, he's going to have to come out eventually. So his opinion is like, I guess he doesn't think Aang in there talking to Roku could do anything that's so powerful that it'll stop him and his whole crew from just taking out Aang the second he comes out. How wrong he is, but we do eventually get the big moment we've been building up towards. Aang meets Roku. We get our first Avatar talking to a past Avatar scene. So a lot of pressure on this one to get this right, and they do. I think they get it right with the sort of kind of charismatic kind of joke here, you know, what took you so long, and then straight down to business of like, I'm the past Avatar, I know what's going on here, and he just presents the plot of the series, and that like we know so little overall. And so he goes over, Sozin used the comet that Aang saw in the previous episode to start the war and deal a powerful strike against the other nations. It's revealed that the comet makes firebenders stronger, and that the comet will return by the end of summer, at which point Firelord Ozai will end the war with another strike. So Aang has to defeat the Fire Lord before the comet arrives, and Aang gets across the idea that that means he's going to have to learn 3 elements in just a couple of months. But Roku is actually confident, despite Aang being super worried, because he has done it before and he shall do it again. So, you know, very, very interesting. I like the confidence from Roku here. Like, Aang is just incredibly worried about everything going on, but Roku's like, no, you've got this because we got this, in a way. Very, very good stuff. But we'll get to the second half of the scene in just a second. But after all the build-up, what were your thoughts on the first past life communication scene?
Yeah, I think this was a really good one. Like, you get to understand a bit of the character from the previous Avatar. Like, you don't get to know that much detail. A lot of that comes, of course, later on. But you get to see a bit of his personality, how he's a bit fun, but he's also serious as well. And the whole situation of what's actually going on, of course, is really serious, just because of how much time is going to be there and how Aang's going to have to do this. So it's definitely a lot to put on, someone's, shoulders, especially that's so young here. But, I think they get across, how it should work, and it doesn't really solve everything. It just sort of, makes him aware of the situation. But I think this is, one of the points where Aang is really, starting to fully grasp, of course, what actually has to be done and what he actually has to do. So I think it does a good job of setting up basically the whole rest of the story.
We talked in the first couple of reviews about how they, don't really mention the Air Noma genocide all that much, and they don't mention it here. It's specifically worded as a powerful strike against the other nations. So you almost forget that it's worded in this way, where that means the Fire Nation used the comet to attack all of the nations, which lines up with the sort of slightly more detailed information we got from the RPG book relatively recently. But clearly the main effect of this strike was the Air Noma genocide and the loss of an entire nation, basically. It's interesting that we never really find out where in the Earth Kingdom did they attack? What part of the Water Tribe were attacked during the comet to cause there to be no backup for the airbenders? That's what I'd like to know. Was there a specific part of the Earth Kingdom that got really badly damaged because of this? Because obviously the attack on the south, the raids on the south happened later. So was this an attack on the north or what? Obviously we don't know. But what are your thoughts on I was remembering that the wording is done that way. He doesn't say, and then the Air Noma genocide happened. It's attack against all the other nations.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely stands out when you watch it again, just because you know what actually happened, or more or less what happened. So yeah, no, I mean, I wonder if that's just him trying to lessen the effect of what it is on Aang, just for Aang's sensibilities, or if it really was more considered just a general strike towards everyone with a focus on the Air Nomads, of course, because that's where the Avatar would have been. That's sort of how I take it, because I mean, you can see Ba Sing Se is still there, right? The Northern Warrior Tribe is still there. We're presuming that the raids, or at least the raids for the South in earnest at least, happen a little bit afterwards, but I could definitely see, sort of the outskirt, sort of nations or locations from the other nations being attacked. I mean, we know from other information, or from other, episodes and stuff, he already tried to, reach out and take over some of the other Earth Kingdom locations even before, they officially declared war or things. And, Roku got at him for actually doing that. So, that they tried, earlier on to sort of like take over some places. So maybe it was those places that were already sort of like, keyed in on being targeted and being occupied were the ones that were sort of like more so attacked, when they had the enhanced abilities of the comet as well. And of course, additional tours, the air nomads and everything like that. So I don't know. I mean, the show doesn't really mention as much, or if ever, directly sort of the whole genocide of the air nomads and them just being completely wiped out or anything like that. So it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't particularly say it in any sort of direct terms in that sort of case here. But I don't know. Sometimes it would make more sense, especially since it seems like the whole rest of the world knows that, the air nomads are no more, that they could have said that, like, the most of the forces went towards the air nomads or something like that. I don't know. I'm sure there's better ways of wording it.
Just as we go through and realize that, they never really call it the air nomad genocide in the show. It's always so weird that from a fan perspective, like, dates are like AG, like BG, like we use the genocide as like the basis for when years are, when there are other ways to do it, but it's just an interesting one. But I just latched onto that a little bit. That like, oh yeah, other nations. Yeah, he does say that. So you sort of wonder, like, was there a like third largest Earth Kingdom city that got like taken out at the start of the war or something like that? But it's interesting to speculate about. So the second half of the Roku scene is that Roku's kind of like, okay, our time's coming to an end here. And Aang says, how can I contact you again? And Roku says, I am a part of you. When you need to talk to me again, you will find a way. So very vague, but they obviously needed to say this because they need to have him be able to contact Roku again without a solstice having to happen. Because it's quite a complicated situation here where you have to be here in this exact room on this island on this date when the light touches the statue and all this sort of stuff. It's opening the door to, you'll be able to contact me again in a less complicated way going forward. So that is good. And it makes sense. Like, we do get that in like 201. They talk to each other. Even in like 116, we get a little Roku scene in the Deserter. This makes sense. This is correct when they say it here. So Roku then says he can help Aang, but only if he's ready. And Aang says he is ready. Avatar state activates, and big surprise, shocking moment. Door opens, and it's Avatar Roku standing there, surprising everyone. Everyone's like shocked, terrified, and we get probably one of the coolest and most powerful, impressive attacks we see in like all of Avatar, as he just puts out this wave of fire that. A lot happens with this wave of fire, with how specific and not specific it is. It's kind of like magic fire almost, what happens here. So he manages to like free everyone, damage only what he wants to, but then he uses the lava bending and just effortlessly, like, I was shocked looking back on it. Like, he does like 2-3 quick moves and the temple's coming down, and the Roku sort of possession of Aang ends. So a lot going on in this scene here, in that it's one of the few times we see this past Avatar like embody themselves like through the current Avatar. But what are your thoughts on this big sequence here?
Yeah, no, this is really cool. Like, just the ability to sort of like see him in the physical form, for all of them to see him in this sort of physical spiritual form, which, it seems like everyone can see it. Like, it doesn't seem like you have to be like spiritually attuned in order to see this. So that definitely like adds to it. I really, I don't know. That's definitely something that you don't see all the time in the show. Just only like a couple other times where you see it, and usually they're not sort of like battling in this sort of case here. So this, I guess this is sort of leading along the lines of sort of like, the borders between the spiritual world and the physical world are blurred, so that like even non-spiritual people with the ability, the enhanced ability of the avatar is able to sort of see the situation. And maybe that's why the fire is so, specific in this ability here, in order to like push other people away, melt the chains, and create like a huge hole in the other end of the temple as well. So I don't know. It's the avatar. Who knows what they can do in this sort of case here, but it's definitely a cool sequence, and to see the lava being like drawn up from the bottom of the temple and everything. I think that definitely just shows the power and ability that the avatar has, and who knows what sort of part of bending that is per se, if it's the fire, the earth side, or whatever. It's the avatar who's able to do this, so it's definitely a really cool sequence.
Yeah, I love the lava karate chop that just like opens the floor up. It's so quick the way it happens. Mm-hmm. It's like it's kind of like the effect that the lava shuriken kind of has when it cuts through stuff, except he just does it straight away. So very cool. But yeah, like you say, this possession kind of thing, we see it with Kyoshi in 205, and I don't think we ever fully like see it again like this, do we? Because there's other situations where like it feels like it happens, but it's not in the exact same way.
Yeah, except for like when Aang's doing his whole early firebending training. That's the only other time I can think of real quick, but I don't know if that's more the spiritual side of seeing it, or if that's real physical side of seeing things.
Yeah, that Zhang scene, like we'll get to that in 116. That's probably one of the most confusing things, because it's like Aang and Roku are talking to him at like the exact same time, and it's neither are aware that this is happening. It's very weird. Which actually brings us back to the point that I wanted to make earlier on. Where Aang and Roku talk, do you believe that is the spirit world?
Oh, that's a good point there. I want to say it is, just because of how they have it sort of set up and everything. But again, the way that they're sort of like playing it off and everything, with like, using it also as like a story element for what's going on in the world, it almost makes like, it seems like it's almost sort of more in sort of like the mindscape of things. But for what they're going for, I wouldn't be surprised if that was sort of like an instance of the spirit world that they're able to connect to, rather than it just being sort of in Aang's mind eye, just because of the whole, if we're going to play up the whole idea of like, the worlds being blended at this time, and there being like a strong connection between the two of them, like it wouldn't, be past it to me to consider that, actually the spirit world for the first time, especially, with everything that's going on. And I guess in terms of like, how they're portraying them, which maybe this is just for effect or whatever, that they're in, sort of their full color bodies. There's nothing really sort of like transparent or anything about them. I don't know. That's how I would consider it, but I definitely could see it be argued another way as well.
Yeah, it's just a weird one, like especially this episode, because they're so all over the place about what is and isn't the spirit world. Where like apparently in the last episode, Aang was in the spirit world, but this is different. But he is also in the spirit world, and it starts to get very confusing in that, like, why did you need to go through all of this if he was already in the spirit world? So a bit of a complicated one. And then if it's not the spirit world, and it is some sort of a like avatar mindscape thing where like it's a spiritual connection, but it's very specific to the avatar because of the whole past lives things, and this is how they can talk to each other without needing to just like meditate into the spirit world or like project a past avatar spirit out of yourself. Is this a way to just have a conversation with one? I'm not really sure. I think lean on the idea of like it probably is the spirit world, just because it feels weird that we would actually technically go through both of these episodes and don't see the spirit world ever. So that's why I like to think that it is the spirit world. It's just not a very notable place in the spirit world, that it is sort of just the most blank kind of section of the spirit world where they just have a talk. And because it is so spiritual, like there's nothing else going on. But yes, it's a little kind of complicated you can sort of tell they maybe didn't want to spoil what the spirit world looked like until they got to the finale, but this is something for sure. But as for the everything else, the temple is destroyed, everyone escapes, Zuko flees, so we just get some quick wrap up here where like the Zhao blames all of the fire sages, and they kind of point out, but Xiaoyu was the only one who actually betrayed us, but he blames them all. And that's basically the way the episode ends. Like, we get away, and Aang is left with the sort of like impossible task ahead of him, but maybe a little bit of confidence that it can actually happen. And so it sets up the next episode. We need to start some bending training straight away, immediately, no matter what it is. So I do like that. And then in terms of resolution on any of this stuff, in the comics we do get the idea that Xiaoyu is freed from prison. He becomes the head sage. So it's nice that we do get to see him again. But do you have any thoughts on the wrap up for this episode?
Not particularly. I mean, I think, it really just drives the point of, there's this big thing coming, and, there's different factors and work on this. But I think, at least you get to see a little bit, just in terms of the overall episode, that, maybe not all firebenders are completely bad. I think that's something that, it's good to get across, at least early on. And it's nice that Xiaoyu does, get a eventual resolution, because you are sort of wondering at the end of this episode, like, sort of what happens to the fire sages, like, what's really going to happen to all of them in this case. So, yeah.
There are reviews for this week. Next podcast, we will be doing another 3 episodes, because again, I planned out the groupings for all the shows for the rewatch. So again, it'll be 2 Avatar, 1 Korra. So for Korra, we'll be doing K107, The Aftermath. And then for Avatar, we'll be doing 109, The Waterbending Scroll, and also 110, Jet. So I'm very excited to discuss The Aftermath, because it's like the big Asami episode. It's actually quite a lot of reveals that happen here. It's a personal favorite from book 1 for me. And then I don't think 109 and 110 are not either of my 2 favorite episodes of Avatar, but I'm interested to see how they stack up, kind of going back to them. Especially Jet as like another one of these book 1 episodes that introduces a character who has a more significant role later on, reflecting on the first episode. Because we've already gone through like Suki, Boomy introduction, now we're getting to Jet. But what are your thoughts on the 3 episodes for next time out?
Yeah, no, the Korra one, that one's always a really good one, because there's a lot going on. But like we said earlier, like once you get past 106, like everything in Korra is like pretty important at that point, at least for the first season. And then for the Avatar ones, the Waterbender one, I think is a nice one, just because you get to see sort of like his training and his sort of like development in waterbending, and a lot on Katara as well. So there's like that little bit of conflict that they have with each other. And then Jet also has like a lot of, sort of conflict. And I think, the idea of those characters and those kids and sort of what they're doing, even if it's for the wrong reasons, I think that's always been something that stands out in the fandom. And as well as just Jet as well, he's like one of the probably more popular minor characters that we have that, eventually just gets, written off. So there's always that element of him as well.
And then I suppose we can maybe also discuss, like, is there any Dao Fei connection with this pirate group? Who knows? Probably not, but we'll get into that. We should have at least probably, I'd say, 2, maybe 3 more shows focusing on the reviews before the Yang Chen novel comes out. Like we said before, we will switch over, like we'll temporarily put the rewatches on hold to focus on the new content. I believe we've done in previous podcasts, I think 3 episodes to cover the books, just so we're not stretching it to cover a full 300-page book in one podcast. So there will be a time when there's a little bit of a break on the rewatch, but we'll get straight back into it after that, of course. But other than that has been episode 245 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's with myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.